Stefan began looking around, trying to determine what had suddenly made the geese panic. And he looked up into the sky, and he saw two cigar-shaped objects with humps in the center. And these objects were slowly descending down towards him. As they got closer to the ground, Stefan noted that they were lit up with a reddish glow. As they got even closer to the ground, he also noted that their shape changed from cigar shapes into disc shapes. Okay, so one of the objects stopped midair and it hovered above Stefan, roughly 15 feet above his head or so, and it kind of just hovered there for about 3 minutes. Then it ascended back towards the sky and it left. According to Stefan, as this first craft left, its glowing red colors changed from red to orange to a gray and then back to a bright orange just as it disappeared into the clouds. And the scariest thing about this craft, according to him, was that for the maneuvers it was making, it was completely silent. So the other object had descended all the way down to the ground and had actually landed on the rock ledge containing the quartz vein that Stefan had discovered and had been chipping away at. So I guess we could say that, well, actually, Stefan was a self-proclaimed skeptic, you could say. He claimed that up until the day of this encounter with this UFO, aliens, alien spacecrafts, and any sort of alien technology were never something that he had really given much thought to. He was not out there looking for this thing. He wasn't concerned with aliens. He had obviously heard reports of like alien sightings and stuff like that in Canada and Marianas Trench in 1960, that little ship had only a 5-inch hull, or like a 5-inch thick steel hull on it. So if the ship that Stefan saw had like a 20-inch wall, excuse the meme, but this ship was thick. It was right around this time that Stefan was kind of lured in even more, and I know I probably would be too, and he wanted to touch it. So he was wearing like welding gloves also, again to protect his hands while he was prospecting, and he reached out and he touched the exterior of the ship, and it was so hot to the touch that it burned a hole right through his welding glove, which is pretty crazy. And then after he touched it, 2 panels slid across the open hatch that had allowed him to look inside, and then a 3rd panel dropped down from above, and the hatch was again completely sealed off. The craft then tilted slightly to the left and began spinning counterclockwise, and a searing beam of heat shot out of the exhaust holes and hit Stefan in the chest. He was in immediate agony because of this beam of heat had actually set his shirt on fire, and it left him with severe burns. So this is a photograph of Stefan showing the physical damage that occurred to him from the ship. So when the blast hit him, whatever came out, it was so hot or so laden with chemicals that it actually set his clothes on fire and knocked him backwards. His chest hair was singed, and he was left with a checkerboard pattern of scorch marks, and the pattern on his chest was the exact same as the formation of exhaust holes that had been on the ship. So, by the time that Stefan managed to rip his burning shirt off his body, the ship had already risen above the trees, and it then began changing colors the same way that the first ship had. And it also changed from a disc shape back into a cigar shape, the same shape that Stefan had originally seen. And after its transformation, like the first one, it disappeared. So, I can only imagine that if you didn't believe that this was an alien ship and it was real, you would probably be going into a little bit of shock from the experience of it, especially after being alone in the woods. You'd probably be feeling extremely terrified, but somehow backwards and left him with some very painful, very serious burns. His chest and hair were singed, and of course, here is the checkerboard pattern of marks that was imprinted into him from the exhaust of the craft. When the doctor treating Stefan asked him how he'd gotten these strange burn marks, Stefan actually lied and said that they were from the exhaust of an airplane. And I think at first it was in fear to how his wife and his family would react, just from the story of this super strange encounter. But anyways, the hospital confirmed that he was indeed burned, but it wasn't radiation, as Stefan had been so worried about. But the hospital concluded that it was actually a chemical burn. And although he was tested for radiation poisoning, the results came back negative, luckily. But his symptoms were associated with possible exposure to radiation, so that was pretty interesting too. After Stefan was released from the hospital, the nausea, the severe headaches, the bad vision, everything associated with the craft, all of his symptoms worsened. And these were like long-lasting effects that made him terribly ill. He hadn't eaten in days since the event had occurred, and he had lost upwards of 13 pounds. And any attempt at eating or drinking resulted in more vomiting. And also, before I forget to mention, the burns in his abdomen suddenly worsened, which was super weird. Yeah, the burns that he had received, they suddenly became like outward sores that protruded outward, and no doctors and no specialists that he went to could figure out what these sores were and why they were not going away. And another interesting note is that Stefan reeked of sulfur. His son claims to have smelled the strong odor as well and said that it filled the room when he went to visit him in the hospital. The smell of sulfur seemed to be seeping out of his pores, and this lasted a long time, even after Stefan returned home. He would walk around the house, and anywhere that his father had been, it was perfumed with a stench of sulfur and a burning motor, as if the smell was literally coming from within Stefan. So, as I mentioned at first, Stefan didn't tell the truth about what he encountered and where these burns had come from. Quickly after he was released from the hospital, however, Stefan saw it as his duty to report this event to the world, no matter how hard it was going to be to tell people and how much he knew he was probably going to be ridiculed for it. He thought it was his duty to tell the world. Whatever this ship had been, whatever this thing was that he had touched, it was clearly some sort of a secret that was being kept from the world. And since it had done so much physical damage to him, he thought it was something that was probably dangerous, and the world had a right to know about it. And as his family explained, Stefan was a Polish soldier before the war, and as a veteran, he had a very strong drive to divulge this secret, dangerous information to the people who deserved to know about it. And this was the only reason that he got and the next day, a helicopter from the Canadian Army joined them. In addition to the air, there were also teams on the ground investigating the area heavily. Also, as stated by the owners of the Falcon Motel, some very official-looking folks started gathering in the hotel lounge, and when he asked where they had come from, one of the men stated that they were from NASA. So, also, apparently, another two So this is a pretty interesting photo, and this is the original document that was sent to the National Research Council through the Canadian Forces Headquarters, and it is a teletype. So as you can see, this document was stamped with the word priority on the top of it, and it explains in detail the events of the encounter with the UFO. So, this document stated May 23rd, 1967, two objects on ground approximately 35 to 40 feet in diameter, 8 feet high, saucer-shaped, color of unpolished steel on ground, and changing to heated metal color on departure. Excess of 1/2 hour, Mr. Michalak observed the two UFOs from a short distance for 1/2 hour and observed one depart vertically, then head south. He went to the remaining one, observing an open door with a violet light preventing him from seeing inside. As he approached, he could hear a whirring sound and indistinguishable voices from within. Upon touching the object with his gloved hand, his hand burned. The door closed, and the object started rotating counterclockwise, then departed vertically, also heading south. His shirt was burned from the exhaust panels on the outer edge, and he required medical treatment for burns on his stomach. He has lost 12 pounds since, as he has been unable to eat. While he was approaching, he could smell what he relates to us as an electrical fire. The noise increased in pitch to a high whine on takeoff. Okay, and then this is actually a picture of the site that was taken from the actual site by investigators after the encounter. And then this is a picture of the site as it is today, or at least a couple of years ago. This is the actual quartz vein that Stefan was prospecting the day of the event, and this is the actual rock ledge where the ship landed. And I also have a picture of the radioactive report. So this is the radioactive report from the National Archives of the Canadian National Forces Operations Center. The samples of soil and rocks taken from investigators at the site were sent to them, and this is what they came back with. Analyses of samples from Falcon Lake UFO Incident. Samples sent by RCMP to Dr. A.H. Booth, National Health and Welfare for radioactivity check. The reports for Dr. Booth indicates a radiation value of 0.3 microuries in the soil sample. Dr. Booth reports that the radiation is from a radium source and is a possible serious health hazard. He is sending an investigator to Falcon Lake area. The radiation levels were so high that Manitoba Mines and Natural Resources were debating whether or not to close Falcon Lake that summer due to public danger. So, I don't know, it's kind of more fun to wonder if it's just a uranium vein, or like I said before, was it just a cover-up? is what the report stated. If Mr. A's reported experience were physically real, it would show the existence of alien flying vehicles